Okay, good evening, everyone. The recording is starting. I'd like to welcome you all to part two of our program on the COVID-19 vaccination. Tonight's program is going to be in two parts. I'll begin with some points from a Jewish perspective, from a perspective of Jewish law, of halakha, specifically regarding the obligation to be vaccinated. And then I'll move on to a few points which gives us things to consider about prioritizing who should get the vaccine first. And then we'll turn the program over to Dr. Sostman for his medical presentation to explain to us how the vaccination works and answer the questions that we have regarding it. So I do want to welcome you, Dr. Sostman, and thank you very much for joining us after what I'm sure was a long day. Dr. Sostman came to me via a conversation I had with Roberta Schwartz, VP at Methodist. I was talking to her about getting information to our congregation about the importance of being vaccinated and getting questions answered about the vaccination. And she recommended, of course, that Dr. Sostman join this program. So I'm very, very grateful to Roberta for making this introduction. I'm very, very grateful to Dr. Sostman for joining and for agreeing to join. And I'm very grateful to Sharon Merritt, who is Dr. Sostman's assistant, who I thought I saw her on. Yeah, I see a box with her name on it, so I'm assuming she's on. Is that you, Sharon? You can unmute and say hello to everyone.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm here.
Thank you for all of your help and for helping with the scheduling and sending the information. Very, very much appreciate your help in making this program possible.
It is our pleasure.
So,
thank you.
Thank you. I am going to mute everybody. If there are any questions, I kindly ask that you put them in the chat. Questions for me and questions for Dr. Sostman, please put them in the chat. And we'll get to them after my presentation, and we'll get to them again. The questions for Dr. Sostman we'll get to after his presentation as well. So please use the chat to put the questions in. Okay, great. Once again, thank you for being here, everyone. I'm going to share my screen with the material that I'd like to speak about. I'm going to run through it pretty quickly because I want to make sure that Dr. Sostman has all the time that he needs. So I'm going to share my screen right now. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk to about is the obligation, is the vaccination required? So of course, when we ask a question like this, we have to mention that there are people for whom, and I'm not going to talk about this at all, and perhaps Dr. Sostman can, for whom it may be medically indicated that they should not get the vaccination. So I'm not talking about those people, because the first rule of halakha and its interface with medicine is that we listen to the doctors. That's the first rule. And so if a doctor tells someone that then it's medically indicated they should not get the vaccination, then they should not get the vaccination. But for everybody else, for whom their personal doctor and the CDC and other or institutions have been saying that it's safe and we should get the vaccination, it's to that group of people, the vast majority of people, that I'm addressing this material. Now, a lot of this material may not be new to you. We've discussed this in other contexts, but I think it's important to look at it. So I'd like to present three approaches to considering the obligation to get vaccinated. One suggesting that it's a Torah obligation, that from the perspective of the Bible, meaning we could look at a verse in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Torah, and we could look at that verse, and that verse will tell us unequivocally that we are obligated to get vaccinated. That's one level of obligation that many of us are familiar with. There's another level of obligation that is rabbinic, right? There's nothing explicitly in the Torah, but based on other factors and based on rabbinic decrees throughout the ages, that would suggest that we are obligated to get the vaccination. And a third category would be what we call minhag, custom. So let's quickly run through all of them with the help of Maimonides, the help of the Rambam. So in the laws of Rotseach, the laws of murder, an interesting place to put this discussion, he says as follows. This is chapter 12, halacha, rule number 4. Echad hagag ve'echad kol davar sheyesh bo sakana ve'ra'ui sheyichashel ba adam v'yamut kigon shayetalo be'er o bor b'chatzirav. Whatever you have, whether it's a roof or any place, anything that might present a danger. For example, if a person has a well or a cistern in their courtyard, says Maimonides, chayav lasot chulia gavoa asarat tfachim. One is obligated to fence it off and put a fence that it is at least 10 handbreadths high around them, or make a cover for them so that a person will not fall and die. Many of us may be familiar that if you have a flat roof and that flat roof is accessible, one is obligated to put a fence around it so that if someone is up there, they don't fall off. A slanted roof doesn't have that same requirement because we assume that no one is going to be up there. And Maimonides continues. Similarly, it is a positive mitzvah. And here's where Maimonides talks about this being a biblical commandment. It is a positive mitzvah to remove any obstacle that can pose a danger to life and to be very careful regarding these matters. As it says in Deuteronomy, in Devarim, beware for yourself and guard your soul. Here's the verse, Hishamer lecha ushemor nafshecha. Right, so that's a biblical verse telling us that we are obligated to protect our lives, and if there is any potential danger to life, we must take steps to remove it. This would apply to personally, and this would apply to a public health hazard as well. So that's where Maimonides states clearly the obligation to protect ourselves and, as you see, protect others from illness. Number 2, on another level, Maimonides also sees a rabbinic obligation to protect ourselves. Harbe divarim asru chachamim mipnei sheyesh bahem sakanat nefashot. Meaning, even if the verse above doesn't apply for some reason, the rabbis created almost a catch-all responsibility to protect against threat to life. The rabbis forbade many matters because they involve a threat to life. Whenever a person transgresses these guidelines, saying, I will risk my life, what does this matter to others? Or I'm not careful about these things, he should be punished by stripes for rebelliousness. So that's interesting. Stripes are lashes, right? So there's we don't have these rules today, but in the time when those rules did exist, right? Someone could be forced to remove any type of danger that they may be responsible for. And it's interesting, right? One has no right to say, oh, it's just my life. Well, that's for 2 reasons. One reason, because it's not your life. It's the life that God gave you, and you are obligated to protect it. And second of all, as we know in this case with COVID-19, it's not only your life, right? We need as many people to be vaccinated as possible so that those who can't, who are not yet, for whom the 5% perhaps for whom it doesn't work, right, can be protected. So we are not really permitted to say it's just me. It's very rare, I would say, that a decision is only going to affect us. And in this case, it could affect lots of people in our surroundings. And finally, Maimonides says the following. These first 2 were in the laws of murder. The next law comes from the laws of personal development. These are harder to pin down and say it's an absolute requirement, but nonetheless, Maimonides makes a case that for other reasons we need to do this. And this is fascinating. Since maintaining a healthy and sound body is among the ways of God, for one cannot understand or have any knowledge of the Creator if he is ill. Maimonides, basing himself on so much, one of the foundational points of his philosophy is that our job in this world, through attaining wisdom and studying Torah and contemplation, is to understand God. But if one is sick, if one is not well, one cannot spend their time doing that. It's just too difficult. They don't feel well. They don't have the energy. They're unable to do it. Therefore, he must avoid that which harms the body and accustom himself to that which is helpful and helps the body become stronger. This is, according to Maimonides, why it's a mitzvah. It's a positive commandment or obligation to live a healthy lifestyle, to eat a healthy diet, to exercise. All of these things are included in this statement. They're as follows: a person should never eat unless he is hungry, nor drink unless he is thirsty. He should never put off relieving himself even for an instant. Rather, whenever he feels the need to urinate, etc., he should do so immediately. And again, there's no doubt that Maimonides probably didn't have the best handle on science, but we have a much better handle on science, and we don't necessarily have to take these specific recommendations, but we do have to understand the general recommendation that we are obligated to be of sound body so that we could go about our responsibilities in the most efficient and healthy way. So we see here, having gone through these things very quickly, that Maimonides, on one level, considers removing danger from oneself or from the public to be a biblical commandment. I have to tell you, when I sent out the notice to the synagogue, if you remember, I sent that notice to the synagogue stating that everyone who can get the vaccination should get the vaccination. And I suggested that a blessing be recited, a blessing of thanksgiving to God be recited when someone gets the vaccination. Someone emailed me back and said, Rabbi, halacha has nothing to do with this. This is, and you should not mix Jewish law with this. And then the person went on to say that really the whole COVID thing is a hoax and most people could fight it off on their own without the need for any help. I did not respond and point out the hundreds of thousands of people in the United States who have died from this already, but that person is wrong, right? That person is simply wrong. Halacha has everything to say about how we engage and how we talk about, and how we must talk about the importance of good health. So from my perspective, it's pretty clear that if one, aside from those for whom it's medically indicated that they should not get the vaccination, everyone else, according to Jewish law, should get the vaccination. Now I want to just check the chat to see if there are any questions about that part so far. Okay, no questions, great. Okay, which means either I've been incredibly clear or no one's really listening, one or the other. Okay, next, let's talk about priority. So Jewish law actually discusses priority in divvying up healthcare. And I'd like to share two approaches. And perhaps if Dr. Sostman has time, he can comment on them. The first approach was suggested by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, for those who do not know, was one of the leading authorities on Jewish law in the 20th century until his passing in the late 80s, in the late 1980s. And his rulings still have a tremendous bearing on all matters of the application of Jewish law to modern life. And in this discussion, he's suggesting a first come, first serve approach, but with a twist. First come, first serve with a twist. First, he notes that there are Talmudic discussions that actually talk about priority in terms of saving lives. If a group of people's lives are being threatened, who does one save first? These are gut-wrenching decisions, yet every society has to deal with them, right? At the beginning of COVID, hospitals were actually dealing with the question of who to give the ventilators to. And there were even reports, I don't know if this happened here in Houston, of having to put 2 people on 1 ventilator, which my understanding is limits the effectiveness for each individual, but may be effective enough to keep both people alive until they're stabilized or until a ventilator comes available. Those are real decisions that doctors and healthcare providers have to make. And sometimes rabbis are asked to weigh in on these questions. I've been asked to weigh in on questions like this. So here Rabbi Feinstein says, and I'll just read you a few lines. And I don't have this translated into English. I will translate it as we go. Inyan kedima leka ela b'ma shenatan v'matnitin v'sof harayot. The rules that we have, that the Torah has regarding priority, are based on the rabbinic statement at the end of the tractate of the Talmud of Harayot. I just mentioned that list. Va'af be'elu kasheh la'asot ma'aseh below iyun gadol. I think that's the key line of this. Even if you have a list, that list cannot be implemented without very, very careful consideration. Va'af be'ofen sheyodin shelefi hadin yesh kedima, vadai hu dafka kisheshavin bizman. This is the twist. Even if one wants to suggest that healthcare needs to be distributed based on first come, first serve, that first come, first serve is based on those who are expected and asked to come at a specific time. If 20 people are told, okay, you're first, then the first of those 20 get it. But number 21, who was not invited, can't skip the line and say, I'm first. So it seems like Rabbi Feinstein is saying, which is very close to what we've done in America, is we create a priority list, but it's in groups. There are groups that are prioritized. And then within that group, we may have no choice other than first come, first serve. We send a link, and whoever is able to, make the appointment first, they will be first on the line. I'm not sure if there's any other way to do it equitably. But it doesn't mean that someone who's not supposed to be on the list should be on the list. This happened to me. A few weeks ago, I got a link to sign up for the vaccination. So I said, what the heck? I signed up. And my wife, Gabi, signed up. And then I began to wonder, this sounds really, really strange. So I called Roberta. And Roberta said, no, it's a mistake. They're going to cancel you. So it turns out they never canceled me. They canceled Gabi. So I called them and I said, look, I got this link. And they said, thank you very much for calling. Don't come. It's a mistake. I said, what if I come? They said, we're going to turn you away because I wasn't in the box, right? I think that's what Rabbi Feinstein is saying. And he goes on to say, "V'yesh laharofeh leilech lemisha nikra kodem, shaharei tekef nitchayev leilech l'sham, v'lahasheni shelo nikra adayin lo nitchayev ad shenikra." The doctor should immediately start treating those who come from the group that was called. But a second person who comes who was not invited is not supposed to be there. Unless, and we've done this too, unless that person is really, really sick. So we've done that too, right? First we started with 75 plus and then 65 plus, but people with other underlying health issues were bumped ahead or were moved into that box because they are what Rabbi Feinstein calls chole bioter, extremely sick. And then finally, as I said before, v'hachra'at davar zeh talui b'dat harofeh. The decision of who gets bumped up is dependent on the doctor. That's approach number one. First come, first serve, based on who the doctors think should be in each group. Now there's another approach, which I don't think has been applied to the vaccination, but may have been applied to treatment of the sick when hospitals in various parts of the countries were overridden and they just simply could not treat everyone. Okay. Sometimes when I touch my earbud, my sound goes off. Jeff, can you still hear me? Okay. So this is from Rabbi Abraham Steinberg. Actually, you know what? I'm going to share a different source of this because I'm only going to share one, and this is more vivid. This is the trolley. This is the Jewish version of the trolley car dilemma. You may be familiar with the trolley car dilemma. A trolley is heading down a track, and if you continue to let it go down the track, it's going to barrel into 15 people. But if you pull the lever, the track will the trolley will move on to a different track and kill one person. So, is one allowed to actively pull that lever? This is an important question in Jewish law, because if the person does nothing, he is what we call in halacha shev ve'al ta'aseh, just doing nothing, letting nature take its course, if you will. However, actively pulling the switch means that the person's taking an active step to decide who shall live and who shall die. Now, the choice is a group of people or one person. Now, just in case you think this is pie in the sky, this is one of the reasons probably why we are not at the point of widespread automatic electric cars, self-driving cars. Because the people who create those algorithms have to figure this out. Your self-driving car is heading, and a mother and her family jumps in front of the crosswalk. And immediately the self-driving car algorithm notices six people, but also notices that if the car takes a quick turn, it's going to hit grandpa, one person. How do the programmers program what to do? That is a huge moral dilemma. So that moral dilemma has been discussed in some very old Jewish sources. This will be the last source that we do. The Chazon Ish, a very, very important rabbinic figure. You see his ears. I'll give you the background. According to the rabbinic tradition, which you have here, if a group of Jews is threatened by enemies, the town is surrounded, and the enemies say, "Give us so and so. Give us." Sorry, Jeff, you're on my screen. "Give us Jeff Horowitz, so we could kill him. And if not, we're going to kill all of you." Says the halacha, they should let themselves be killed and not deliver them one soul from Israel. But, I'm sorry. If they say, "Give us one, or we're going to kill you all," we all have to be willing to die. We are not allowed to choose. But if they say, "Give us Jeff," meaning they've chosen, then we could give you over, because they've chosen. So based on this, the Chazon Ish asked the following question. It's far-fetched, but as I explained, it's not so far-fetched. Someone shoots an arrow, and the arrow is going to kill 6 people. Someone there, Wonder Woman apparently, has a shield, and she could redirect the arrow to kill just one person. If she does nothing, 6 people are going to die. If she uses her shield, one person is going to die. And he suggests to Chazon Ish that's not like this story of the enemies surrounding the village. Because there, the people are, it says here, Dahatam hamesirahi pu'ula ha'achzariya shel harigat nefesh. In that case, you are doing the cruel act of handing someone over. Upulat zeh leka hatzalat achirim b'teva shel ha'pula ela hamikra garam achshav lahatzalat achirim. That act in and of itself is not directly connected to anyone's life being saved. It just happens to be. that someone's life is going to be saved, right? Because when you redirect the arrow, okay, leka hatzlat acherim beteva shel hapula ela hamikra giram achshav haslat acherim gam hatzalat acherim kashur b'ma shemosrin lahariga nefesh b'Yisrael. The people are being saved because you're giving someone over to be killed. But when it comes to redirecting the arrow from one side to the other side, that is what he calls pu'ulat hatzalah, right? In the case of giving over the person, the action you take causes you're giving the person to them, so it's causing the death. But the action you take here of redirecting the arrow, right? The actions on the arrow, that he calls a saving act, an act of saving someone's life. Ve'ena kishura klal baharigat hayachid acher. It's not really connected to the death of the one person. Rak achshav b'mikre nimtza b'tzad acher nefesh miYisrael. It happens to be that in the way of this arrow is one person. V'acharesha b'tzad zeh yahargu nefashot rabot uvazeh echad efshar yesh lanu lishtadel lima'et avedat Yisrael. And since if you make the choice, one person will be killed. And if you don't make the choice, 6 people will be killed. It seems to make sense to go ahead and as much as possible to limit the death. So if the Chazon Ish was alive and he was working at Google, right? We know how he would program the car. He would program the car to veer away and do what's necessary to kill the fewest people. So this approach may have been used, for example, in the early days of COVID, when maybe there were 3 really, really sick people there, but those really, really sick people, they didn't really stand a chance. So maybe the doctors decided not to treat them and to treat the other people who had a chance. Even though generally speaking, you treat everyone, but when there's a triage situation, these difficult choices have to be made. And so that's another approach to public health, which is you do what you need to do to save the greatest number of people, right? And so that was, again, the discussion of how to give out the vaccination. Some suggested you should actually give it to the younger people because they're the super spreaders. And if you take the super spreaders out of the equation, more people will live. On the other hand, the people who are most susceptible and die at the highest numbers are the elderly. So maybe they should get it. We know the choice that our government made, but this other option of the good of the greatest number is another approach that halachists, experts in Jewish law, and philosophers of medicine and doctors also have to decide. So those are some of the issues that come up with questions of who gets priority. Is it a simple first come, first serve within a group that the doctors chose? And then but the question is, the second point is, which group should the doctors choose? Should they choose a group that's going to lead to the greatest number of lives being saved? Or they should choose a group who are right now the most at risk? And those are really, really difficult questions, which I'm not sure if they're made on the state level or the federal level, but those were made. So that's the end of my presentation. I see a note here from Andrea. It also sounds like redirecting responsibility to an object rather than an individual, even though the individual is responsible for activating the arrow. It could be that that's what he is suggesting, because you're not handing over a person, the action is on the arrow. It could be. But there is some indirect responsibility nonetheless. Yes. So that's what I wanted to share with you in terms of the questions of obligation and some different ways that Jewish law looks at priorities in who gets vaccinated. I am now going to turn the program over to Dr. Sostman, who I've just made co-host. So Dr. Sostman, please go ahead And feel free to, I'll unshare, and you could now share your screen and share your slides. And thank you again for joining us. We're very, very grateful for your time, for sharing your time and expertise with us.
Well, thank
Oh,
you,
I have to,
Rabbi.
yeah, okay, great. You're unmuted. Fantastic.
Can you can hear me, and can you see my slide?
Yes and yes.
Very good. Well, thank you, Rabbi. For this was really interesting to hear the Jewish law perspective on some of these questions that we grapple with. So thank you for that. And I want to thank you all for listening to this. Anything that I can do to help educate people, I'm happy to do. And I think as we go along, perhaps if you have questions, use the chat function, and perhaps I can ask Rabbi Gelman to serve as kind of the chat moderator.
Happy to do it.
Okay, great.
Yep.
So I'm going to mostly talk about the vaccines and how to keep yourself safe. But in order to put it into context, I'm going to talk a little bit about treatments first. First, drug treatments, then monoclonal antibody treatments. Then we'll talk about the vaccines and a couple of sort of contemporary topics. What could go wrong? What about these different strains of highly contagious viruses that you're reading about in the paper? And what about seasonal factors? So here is a summary of pretty much all of the treatments that are either proven or maybe effective in COVID-19. And it's categorized according to whether it's for outpatients, people in the hospital, or people in the hospital who are really, really critically ill and near death. And I think one thing you can see is that although we have a lot more treatments available now than we had 8 months ago, the cupboard is still relatively bare. The one really effective treatment we have for outpatients is monoclonal antibody infusions, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. And for people who are sick enough to be in the hospital, we have corticosteroids, so dexamethasone, cortisone, you've probably heard of these. The monoclonal antibodies will reduce the need for hospitalization or the development of severe illness by about 60 or 65%. And corticosteroids for really severely ill patients will reduce the risk of death by about 30%. We also have remdesivir, an antiviral drug, which can shorten the hospital stay a bit. Really doesn't seem to actually reduce mortality very much, if at all. We have convalescent plasma, which can be quite effective, but only in very, very specific circumstances. This requires a very highly concentrated form of plasma, which you don't get from every convalescent person. And it also has to be given quite soon after the hospital admission. So in a lot of circumstances, it's not going to be effective. There are a number of other drugs that are in the possibly effective category, and I won't go into those in any detail other than to say there is a lot of research going on. We at Houston Methodist have about a dozen drug protocols at any one time. But the progress in treatments, good though it has been, is far from solving the problem. And again, I won't go into the drugs in much detail, but this will give you a kind of a little insight into the life cycle of this virus. If you start at the upper left-hand corner of the picture, and then follow the virus counterclockwise down to the bottom, and then back up to the upper right-hand corner, you'll see how it does its dirty business. First, it hooks onto your cell with a protein receptor. And that protein receptor happens to be the one against which all of our vaccines are directed. Because once we can block that receptor, we can keep the virus out of your cells. Then the virus tricks your body or tricks your cell into letting it inside the cell. It unpacks itself. It releases its genetic material, which is RNA. It replicates that genetic material and then uses it to hijack the machinery of your cell to make proteins and other components that will reassemble into many, many, many other viruses. And then gets out of the cell either by tricking your cell into exporting it or by killing the cell. And then when the cell dissolves, viruses are released in great numbers. The drugs we are using now are mostly in this red box called replication inhibitors that prevent the virus RNA from copying itself. And they're somewhat effective, but not terribly. The big advance has been in the green box, the anti-inflammatories, the corticosteroids, and so forth, that reduce the very, very severe illness that people can get from this dysregulated immune response to the virus. So there's a lot of work yet to do here, but I would say the progress has been limited. The one really good news story in treating COVID is these monoclonal antibodies. And in order to help you understand both those and the vaccines, I'm going to give you 8 years of college and medical school immunology in one slide. So what happens when you get, let's say, a virus or some foreign substance introduced into your body? It's picked up by a special kind of cell that is part of what's called your innate immune system, which is very, very ancient from an evolutionary perspective. Very primitive, powerful, but not terribly specific. That antigen presenting cell processes the antigen and presents it to what's called the adaptive immune system, which is a much more highly evolved, much more specialized, much more specific, and much more powerful immune system. That process then generates either cells that produce antibodies or cells that differentiate into what are called killer cells or cytotoxic T cells that actually attack and destroy cells that have been infected by the virus. And finally, that is the system that creates this long-lasting immunological memory that is the basis of all vaccinations because it gives your body a head start in reacting to a virus or an infection or a foreign substance. But if you look at that red box over to the left, there's also a way of giving passive immunity. And that is if you have antibodies that you know react against an infection, you can concentrate those and use them just like a drug. And that's what monoclonal antibody treatments are doing. They're concentrating antibodies that are very, very specific and powerful to fight this virus and using them just like a drug. And one question that has bedeviled us for several months, and we're just starting to get some answers to it, is do antibodies really protect you? And in particular, one of the questions has been, if you have gotten COVID, are you protected from reinfection? And the answer to that appears to be yes, not perfectly, but probably about 80% or maybe 90% protected.
Dr. Sostman, I'll just let you know, so interesting. Our congregation has been really spared, but we do have one person who's gotten it twice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does happen. It's pretty rare, but it does happen.
Yeah.
And you can kind of get a feel for that on this slide. The horizontal axis is months of 2020, starting in April, and the vertical axis is basically the number of infections, if you will. And people who had, when this study started, who had COVID and had antibodies in their blood, that's this red line. And you can see starting from about July, forget about the early months, those are coexisting infections. So starting in July, you could see gradually people who do not have antibodies. I think I said that wrong. That's people who without antibodies is the red line. You could see the cumulative number of infections rising as time passes. People who did have antibodies, who had been infected, are the blue line. And you can see that they do get some reinfections, but it's much, much less. So that is the principle behind using monoclonal antibodies. It's basically creating an antibody drug that will do what natural infection has done, put a bunch of antibodies into your blood to clear the virus out. That's great, but there's some bad news here as well. And the bad news is that although this appears to be quite effective, as I said, 60 to 65% reduction in the development of severe disease or hospitalization, but it only seems to be effective if it's given early. So the authorization from the FDA for this antibody drug is for mild to moderate COVID-19. You have to have a positive test and you have to be at high risk for severe disease. And there's a whole set of criteria for that, which I won't detail. But it has to do with obesity, chronic disease, and so forth. So these are very, very effective, but in very specific, relatively limited circumstances. The other problem with them is it's a bit of a production. It's kind of a 4-hour commitment. You have to get an hour-long infusion. You have to be watched for an hour afterwards to be sure that you don't have an allergy to the drug, and so forth and so on. So a lot of people, when they get a positive test, say, I'm not feeling so bad. I'm not sure I want to spend 4 hours in your lovely infusion center getting this. But it's becoming more and more popular. We have done about 2,000 of these. And our experience is very consistent with the research that was done. Instead of maybe a 10 to 15% rate of hospitalization, we're seeing in these patients about 4%. So it's good. But isn't it better not to get COVID in the first place? And of course, the answer to that is yes. So that's the vaccines. And there are 3 that are approved in Western countries. I'm not going to talk about Russia or China or those. But what we have here in America is the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine. In the United Kingdom, there's also an AstraZeneca vaccine. And, 6 months ago, we didn't know if vaccines would work for this. We didn't know, would they be a little effective, a lot effective? I think everybody was stunned by how effective these vaccines are. And in fact, if you've made a lot of money in the stock market over the last couple of months, you can thank these vaccines, because this was a huge positive shock to everybody's forecasts for sickness, death, and the economic recovery. So what do these vaccines do? They generate a huge amount of antibodies in your blood, much more than COVID-19 itself does. They generate this cellular immune response so that you will get an immune memory. And they have about a 95% effectiveness at keeping you from getting sick with COVID. Now, the one thing that we don't know about these, and this bears perhaps a little bit on some of these these priority questions. One thing we don't know is whether it protects you actually from getting infected with the virus. You can be, as you know, with COVID, you can be infected but be asymptomatic. And what we do not know about these vaccines is whether it prevents you from getting infected or whether it simply protects you from getting sick. There is some reason to believe.
Dr. Sostman,
Yes.
what's the difference between?
Okay. I'll try to explain it when I. So there were studies done in monkeys where they gave the monkeys the vaccine. They waited until the monkeys, developed their immune response, and then they sprayed COVID up the monkeys' noses. Then, after they waited a week or two, and then they tried to recover live virus, infectious virus, from the monkeys, either nasal secretions or, pulmonary fluids or whatever. With the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, they were unable to recover any living virus, which means they sprayed the virus into the monkeys. The monkeys' bodies totally rejected it and cleared it out, and there was no virus left in their bodies. In that circumstance, if that holds true for humans, that means that once you've been vaccinated, you can no longer transmit the infection to other people. But we don't know that's the case because those studies have not been done in human beings. Nobody ethically was willing to intentionally infect someone with COVID. If you look down at the bottom, the AstraZeneca vaccine, which appears to be a little weaker than the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, did not protect the monkeys from infection. They looked and felt fine. They didn't have fevers. They were happy doing, whatever monkeys do. But when they sampled the nasal secretions from the monkeys, there was living virus in there that could infect other monkeys. So in that case, the COVID vaccination would not protect a person from spreading the disease to other people. And I think the fact that we don't know whether the vaccination protects you from getting sick, or whether it actually would, abolish the virus from your body and protect you from transmitting the disease to other people, probably a good argument against the philosophy of let's vaccinate people who would be most likely to give it to other people. Because we actually don't know if that would work and whether it would achieve its goal. What we do know is that this vaccine will prevent people from getting sick and dying. So I think that may be at least one argument for the course that was chosen, which is we know it'll work. So how do these work? Well, basically what they do is, in one way or another, deliver some viral genetic material to your body. Not a complete virus. It cannot make you sick. It basically gives a kind of biological software instruction to your cells to produce this one protein that the virus uses to latch on to your cells. This the spike protein, so-called. These are these little studs that come out of the virus that look like a military, naval mine. And it instructs your cells to produce that protein. That protein then gets expressed on the surface of your cells, and you develop immunity to it. Now, a lot of people then, are concerned about, well, is this going to get incorporated in my DNA? Is it going to make me a hybrid of some sort? And the answer to that is no, because these biological molecules get degraded and metabolized and dissolved in fairly short order. And in fact, even if they did not, the flow of genetic information is a one-way flow. So this is not a realistic concern. What's the this is really the picture that launched 1,000 stocks upwards in the S&P 500 and the Wilshire 5000. This is the efficacy data from the Pfizer vaccine. And again, on the horizontal axis is time. This is days after you got your first dose. And on the vertical axis is the cumulative incidence of sickness from COVID. And what you can see is that people in the blue line who were not vaccinated just kept getting sick. More and more of them kept getting sick as time passed. The red line, which is the vaccinated group, really almost stopped getting ill after about 2 weeks. And that's that little inset up in the upper left-hand corner of the slide. That's a blown up view of the first 21 days after the first inoculation. And what you can see is that those curves start to separate after about 10 days. So for the first 10 days after you got your first shot, you're not protected at all. And then gradually you start to acquire some protection. And this is another thing that several people have said to me. My uncle got the COVID vaccine and a week later he got COVID. And does that mean that the COVID vaccine made his body more susceptible? No, what it means was that a week later he just wasn't protected, and COVID is so rampant in our community that the coincidence of getting vaccinated and getting COVID is actually pretty common. So are you protected after one dose? Yeah, to some extent, probably 60 to 80% protected. We don't know how long it lasts. Therefore, it's really important to get 2 doses. How about safety? In the clinical trial, a lot of people got what are called reactogenic effects, which is actually a good thing. It may not feel like a good thing, but it's evidence that your body's processing the antigen and reacting to it. You may get a sore arm where the injection was given. You may get a fever, some muscle aches, joint pains, fatigue. These things will typically last for about 24 hours, and they're treatable with Tylenol or Motrin. Nothing to be alarmed about at all. Allergic reactions are something that were really not seen in the clinical trial very much, but we have seen a few. And in fact, worldwide, there have been a number of severe allergic reactions, about 1 in 100,000 people. Does that mean that you should fear the vaccination? No, it's very treatable. A little unpleasant, but very treatable. Nobody's died from it. And if you put it in perspective, your chance of dying from COVID in the United States is about 1 in 1,000. And I'm not talking dying from COVID if you get COVID. I'm talking about dying from COVID if you're a person who's alive in America today. Your chance of getting a severe reaction, not fatal, but something that will seriously inconvenience you for the rest of the day, with the vaccine is about 1 in 100,000. So you get about a factor of 1,000 there. And that's why it's such a no-brainer to get the vaccine. I won't go into the other vaccines that are under development to any detail. Just suffice it to say that there are many, 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 many under development worldwide. Probably the next one that we'll see in America is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And the estimated time for that to get approved and get into circulation is probably March. They should have their clinical trial data ready by, let's say, the end of January, beginning of February, probably be reviewed by the FDA late in February. And assuming that the phase 3 data is as good as their phase 1, phase 2 data, it will, I think, be approved for use in March. That'll help a lot because it's effective with 1 dose instead of 2. And it only requires normal refrigeration. It's a lot easier to store and ship and so forth. The next one could be the Novavax vaccine. And I'll show you just a picture of that. It's a totally different concept. They actually grow the spike protein in the cell culture and then create a little synthetic particle and inject that. And that's what your body becomes immune to. But everybody's looking at this spike protein as the thing for immunity. Potential obstacles, some people don't want to be vaccinated. There can be manufacturing delays. And just the logistical challenge of trying to vaccinate a couple 100 million people in 6 months is quite significant. So what could go wrong? Let's try to finish up with some of the things that have been in the newspaper. And one you'll see is these viral mutations. This is totally normal. All viruses mutate. And in fact, the coronavirus mutates a whole lot slower than influenza. And, influenza, you have to get a new vaccine every year. We don't know yet what the situation is going to be with coronavirus. Could be every year, could be every 5 years. It probably won't last for a lifetime because these viruses do change. But it certainly won't be more often than yearly. And there's a whole alphabet soup of different viral mutants out there. The one you've probably heard about the most is either the D614G, which spread throughout Houston over the summer, and now is pretty much the dominant strain here. Everybody was totally freaked out by this because it too is more infectious. The interesting part is it's probably more sensitive to antibodies than the strain that it replaced. So it could actually be that some of these more transmissible strains are a blessing in disguise. And from the virus's point of view, if viruses can be said to have a perspective, the virus just wants to replicate itself. And killing its host is not a particularly good way to accomplish that goal. And that's why transmissibility seems to be preferred as a viral evolutionary characteristic as opposed to lethality. Of course, the big concern here is what if it mutates so much that the antibodies don't recognize it and the vaccines are ineffective? Well, it's probably more of a concern for the monoclonal antibodies because they're so specific and precise. The antibodies that your body develops in response to the vaccine are very, very variable, and they cover a lot of territory. So the virus has to really mutate a tremendous amount to escape the effects of vaccination. That's the good news, but transmissibility is actually a very, very dangerous thing. And a question posed is, would you rather have a virus that's 50% more transmissible or 50% more deadly? And in fact, the correct answer is you'd rather have one that's 50% more deadly. Because assuming that you have a particular transmissibility and mortality, you'll end up with a certain number of deaths after a few months, about 10 transmission cycles. If you increase the lethality of the virus by 50%, you'll end up with 50% more deaths, roughly speaking. And that's because it's a linear function of lethality. But if it's more transmissible, this is an exponential function. This goes up as the square. And you can end up with a huge increase in cases. Same amount of mortality, you'll end up with many more deaths. So this is something to take really, really seriously, these transmissible viruses. So what's the deal with these viral mutations? They're a normal process that occurs continuously. SARS-CoV-2 is actually kind of a laggard compared to, for example, influenza or even worse, HIV. Over time, we'll probably have to update the vaccines. But actually, the technology that's in these two vaccines we have now is very, very suitable for being updated. All you have to do is change the payload of the vaccine a little bit, and you cover the new virus. So I think, you know, the news on that is really, really quite good. For now, however, if this virus spreads as it's predicted to do, you know, this English mutation, you'll have a more contagious virus, and it's winter. And, you know, winter is here. Viruses are seasonal in many cases. And if you look at the blue bars up there, you'll see this one called HCoV. There are actually 4 strains of coronavirus that circulate in the human population normally. And they're responsible for about 20% of the common cold. And a lot of people think that SARS-CoV-2 is ultimately going to evolve to just be another one of those nuisance winter common cold viruses. Of course, now it isn't. So if coronaviruses are worse in the winter, why did we get slammed so hard in the summer? Well, the reason for that is just that there was nobody who was immune. So there was basically nothing to slow the virus down. Why are respiratory viruses worse in the winter? There's a whole host of reasons. Your immunity goes down in the winter. You're indoors more in the winter, so you can spread the viruses more closely. Your indoor environment, the low relative humidity, fosters the survival of the virus in droplets on surfaces. Viruses like that dry condition. So respiratory viruses are worse in the winter. So what can you do to protect yourself? Well, you follow those normal precautions, the masks, the hand washing, and the social distancing, to, you know, just become obsessive about it, you know, be totally punctilious about those normal precautions. Spend as much time outdoors as you can. And isn't that wonderful that we live in Houston instead of North Dakota or Manitoba or Michigan? Because we can spend time outdoors in the winter. You know, there were a few chilly days, but I think next week is, you know, the highs are going to be in the 70s. So if the weather is nice and it's warm, spend a lot of time outdoors. If you're indoors and you have some control, you got a humidifier at home, set your relative humidity for about 50%. Open the windows and let fresh air in when you can. If there's someone sick at home, get a portable air filter and a HEPA filter. Make sure you get your vitamin D levels checked. Although this is not 100% proven, there's a lot of evidence that if you're vitamin D deficient, you're more susceptible to infection. Don't go crazy taking vitamin D if you're not deficient, because too much doesn't help you. But there's a lot of evidence that keeping your levels within normal range is helpful. Get extra sleep. You want to take that nap on the weekend, go for it. And of course, get your flu shot, because, you know, God protect you if you get flu and COVID at the same time. So that's all I have to say. And I've probably spoken for way too long, so I apologize for that. But we've gone through some treatments, some preventive measures, and you know, what could go wrong for us now and what to do about it. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay, there are some questions. So I'm going to start at the top, Dr. Sostman, and ask you to answer in brief, I would say. And okay, so here we go. Number one, if you get COVID and have antibodies and then give blood and give antibodies, will you lose them and put yourself at risk?
No, because your your memory immune cells will be there to bail you out if you contact the COVID virus again.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Can you talk about the side effects to people with diabetes?
For COVID or for vaccination?
Good question.
Okay. Well, for vaccination, there's no particular special side effects, or, you know, more or less side effects. For COVID, people with diabetes are at higher risk for more severe forms of the disease, so they need to be extra careful.
Okay.
Rabbi, can I extend on this? That was my question. I'm talking about side effects to people that have diabetes, that their sugar level went up after vaccine for about more than a week, and then started to go down, and there is no research about it that we were told.
Yeah, no, we we don't have any data on that, but clearly, if you get an inflammatory reaction, that's a possible. You know, you could see how that could result in elevation of your glucose. So you should definitely be monitoring it, and in conjunction with your doctor.
Is it going to be worse on the second vaccine?
Hard to know. Those effects of fatigue and fever and so forth tend to be worse on the second vaccination. So if in fact the elevation of the sugar is related to that, it could be worse.
Okay, thank you. Since we don't know if vaccination prevents infection and therefore the possibility of transmission, what does this imply in terms of future recommendations regarding masking, social distancing, and so on?
So I guess the question is, you know, oh my God, are we going to be wearing masks for the rest of our lives? And I think the answer to that is no. Certainly while we are without the data about transmission, it's very important for people, even after they've been vaccinated, to keep masking, social distancing, and so forth. And I think it's good practice just to protect yourself while the virus is so rampant in the community, because remember, the vaccine's 95% effective, not 100%. I think we will get that information within the next year or so as to the transmission. My guess is that the more potent vaccines, like the ones we have in the community now, probably are going to block transmission, and probably that will obviate the need for a lot of these precautions. But I gotta say that COVID's not the only respiratory virus out there. And I myself am very strongly planning to wear a mask in the flu season from now on. Because you may have noticed that there's almost no influenza this year.
Mm,
That's because people
wow.
are wearing masks, they're socially distancing, they're washing their hands, and the flu shot rate went way up this year, which is, people were just being smart.
Wow,
And
that is so interesting.
influenza has basically disappeared.
Ah, wow. Okay, thank you. Next question. What do the different antibody responses on the chart mean? I'm not sure now if we could reference what chart that is. So maybe do you understand that question, doctor, or should we move on?
Well, let me see if I can go back to some of the antibodies. You mean this one where it's about the different vaccines, where it says antibody response 2 to 8x CP? Is that the one you're asking about?
Yes, that was the one.
Okay, so CP is convalescent plasma. So the antibody levels in the blood of somebody who's had COVID and recovered from it. And what you see in this column is that the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines are producing antibodies that to about 5 or 10 times, even up to 30 times the amount of antibodies that you get from COVID infection. So really, really huge production of antibodies. And that is, I think, probably why you see the column that says protection, in the monkeys, they were protected from infection. They had what's called sterilizing immunity. The AstraZeneca vaccine down in the lower row produced antibodies about the same as if you had COVID infection. So a much lower level of antibody production. And it protected the monkeys from getting symptomatic disease, but not from getting infected and transmitting the virus to other monkeys. So that's what those antibody response things were.
Okay, thank you. Hey, Dr. Sostman, we have a bunch more, so you tell me when you're done.
Okay.
Okay.
How about another 10 minutes?
Perfect. Okay, great. Here we go. If one does get the second shot when one is supposed to, or if it becomes, I'm sorry, if one does get the second shot when one is supposed to, or if it becomes not available, how much later might it still be worth taking the second shot?
That's a great question. And the answer depends a little bit on how much of a stickler you are for doing things just so. What I think is probably more important is not to get the second shot too soon, because the purpose of the second shot is after you've developed immunity, to kind of strengthen that immunity and lock it in those memory cells. The data that we have is from the AstraZeneca vaccine in the United Kingdom. They found that actually if they waited 12 weeks between the two doses, they actually developed stronger immunity than if they did it within a month. We have no idea whether the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines would behave the same or not. But that's the basis why the United Kingdom has taken this policy of let's just vaccinate everybody with a first dose. And as long as we get the second dose into them within about 3 months, it'll all be fine. We're not taking that policy, but certainly if you had to wait a couple of extra weeks, we're quite sure that that's perfectly safe. And really, even if I got the first dose and then for some reason, if I had to wait for 3 months, I would still get the second dose. What I might do after that is wait for a couple of weeks and then get my antibody levels measured. I think there's not a lot of good reasons to get your antibodies measured, but that might be one.
Thank you. Is there any truth to the doctors that say there are contraceptives in the vaccine and it could sterilize young people?
No, it's absolutely false. I don't know who's putting that out, but it's really a disservice to the public.
Yeah. Thank you. What is the difference in the T cell response? Which vaccine is more effective? Before you answer the question, could you explain the question?
Sure. Let me go back to this one slide, course in 8 years of immunology. And remember that, first the antigen gets picked up by a specialized cell that kind of processes it. And then it presents it to a T cell, which is one of your specialized immune cells. That T cell will then, or in the aggregate, that population of T cells will then differentiate or develop into two different pathways. One of which will ends up with production of antibodies, and the other one of which ends up with the production of what are called killer cells that go after the cells in your body that are infected by the virus and destroy them before they can make more virus. So this is the T cell response, and it is very much related to the ultimate develop of long-lasting immunological memory, and it's one of the kind of two effector arms of the immune system. So if we go back to this chart here, the T cell response, you see that in these groups, and these are really difficult measurements to make. So this data all tends to be, if they studied 1,000 people, they measured their T cell response in maybe 25. So this data is very noisy data. But what you can see is that pretty much everybody generates a T cell response. That's important. The balance between the antibody response and the T cell response is one of the factors of kind of tuning the immune response. And it does look like maybe these RNA vaccines that we have focus more on the antibody part of the response than the T cell part, but they all give a T cell response.
Okay. How about two more? Is that okay? Two more questions?
Sure.
Okay. How quickly can newly specific monoclonal antibodies be developed if the virus undergoes a significant mutation?
A great question. You know how I said that you could update these messenger RNA vaccines in probably about 6 weeks? Monoclonal antibodies would take probably several months to retool and re-engineer and produce in quantity. So what what the companies are doing, and this is very smart, is they're actually producing cocktails of several different monoclonals. The first monoclonal that was tried out against COVID was a single antibody, monospecific monoclonal antibody. And what they found was about 6% of the people had a virus that was resistant to it after treatment. So it exerted selective pressure on the virus. It caused it to evolve in such a way that it escaped from the monoclonal antibody. When they updated the cocktail and put two different monoclonal antibodies in it, 0% escaped. So they're taking more of a preventive approach to try to prevent these what are called escape mutations. But it would take longer for the monoclonals to be updated.
Okay. And finally, the last question. Everybody appears to be focused on COVID mortality. Can you comment on COVID morbidity?
Great question. Really, really good question. This relates to, I think, some of these what are called long haulers, or these protracted COVID syndromes that relate to people who have chronic fatigue, cognitive problem, brain fog, young people who have heart inflammation, people who have severe COVID, who develop clotting problems and get strokes or pulmonary emboli, or lose a foot because of an arterial embolus. So the morbidity in COVID is quite substantial, even if people do not die. I think the reason that people talk about the mortality rate is, obviously it's in many ways the worst thing that can happen. It's also a very measurable endpoint. It's a little less clear exactly what the prevalence of a cognitive damage from COVID is, or how long it lasts, but it's probably at least oh golly, if you have a case of COVID, you probably have at least a 10% chance of developing some kind of chronic complication related to it. So it's quite significant, and it's a great question.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm sorry we did not get to all of the questions. I do urge anyone who has questions to ask their doctor these questions. I'm sure your doctor can be helpful. You could ask me, and I'll be happy to make up an answer. But and you could ask your questions on Jewish law to Dr. Sostman.
That's
and
right.
He could make up an answer. And then we'll be fantastic. We'll take our show on the road. I do want to thank you very, very much, Dr. Sostman, for joining us and for giving us a very detailed yet very understandable explanation of so many aspects of this. And I want to again thank Roberta for setting this up and for making the introduction. It's really wonderful to have people who are on the front lines with so much knowledge, who are willing to come into the communities to help us understand better and to put us at ease and to make us better, I guess, consumers of what's out there medically. So thank you again so much. Thank you everyone for joining. I wish everyone a good night, and that's it. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening.
It was a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Rabbi